Hello, everybody. Welcome to 4235. Nice to see you. And today we're going to continue our conversation about economic inequality or wage disparity as it is reflected, if you will, in the question of race and racism and racial inequality. So, this notion of wages, income disparity, and race, racism, and racialization in Canadian society. So this week we're looking at two articles, both of which are authored by Grace Edward Galabuzzi. One is co-authored by him with Sheila Block. And I'm going to really just talk about that first article and then kind of sprinkle in maybe some comments about the second article. But the first article, Canada's color coded labor market, I think is quite interesting and quite fascinating, and is really an extension, or if you will, part two of last week's discussion that we began with looking at Krishna Pendekar and Ravi Pendekar's article around income disparity in Aboriginal populations and in, if you will, non-white or racialized communities, and also Oropoulos' article about the, if you will, the resumes that had the switched names, right? And about how the callbacks were much less for people with non-Western names. So it's really a continuation of that conversation from last week, this notion of wage disparity. Can we understand wage disparity to be related to race, racism, racialization, racial inequality? Is it possible to identify that? I think it is. So Sheila Block and Grace Edward Galabuzzi write at the beginning of that article that they write for Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives. They write, quote, "Even in the best of economic times, the pay gap between racialized and non-racialized Canadians is large. Racialized Canadians earn only 81.4 cents for every dollar paid to non-racialized Canadians." So that's on average, right? This notion of racialized meaning non-white Canadians. So 81.4 cents. So I think we could, if we just stopped there, I think we could say their parsing of the Stats Canada data in terms of wages and people's self-declaration, self-identification in terms of their ethnicity or their race. We could stop there and agree, okay, well, 81.4 cents is less than $1. In fact, it's about 19 cents less. So we could just stop there. We can say, okay, well then, yes, people who are non-white, according to the census, especially looking at the long-form census, they are indeed making less money. Now, the question, of course, for us to ask and to speculate is that related to, if you will, some type of overt racism, some type of institutional racism, or some type of systemic structural racism, right? Which is, of course, how we began this course. And I think I tried to point out how difficult it is, I think, to put your finger on this notion of structural or systemic racism and say, aha, this is it. This is what's actually causing, if you will, the 19 cents less that you're getting if you're not white. Very difficult, I think, to measure. But nonetheless, let's go through his data. Sheila Block and Galabuzzi's data, the co-authors' data. Yeah. So they also find, not just in terms of the income disparity, they also find that in their study, racialized workers get work that is more likely to be insecure, temporary, and low paying. And again, I think this correlates and confirms what Krishna Pendekar said in his basically 20 years of studying racialized workers in Canada, and in particular their pivot in the last 10 years to looking at Indigenous workers. Yes, people who are racialized are more likely to be, if you will, be overrepresented at these lower paying jobs. If you remember, there was a discussion about whether there was a sticky floor, right? There's certainly a glass ceiling, but maybe there is some type of function. And I think there was we had a discussion, if you recall, if you review that conversation we had, where I interviewed Krishna Pendekar, we had that discussion where, is there actually something happening, or is it that we don't know what's happening, but there certainly is a quote unquote overrepresentation of, if you will, racialized people at the bottom of the labor market. Two, I think, again, if we look at Block and Galabuzzi's studies, we know that racialized men are 24% more likely to be unemployed than non-racialized men. And racialized women are 48% more likely to be unemployed than non-racialized men. Again, these are just the classic statistical parsing of the data. So what do you think? Do you think that this is proof, if you will, that race, racialization, or racism plays a part in people's underemployment in Canada? I think it does. Quote, between 2000 and 2005, during one of the best economic growth periods for Canada, racialized workers contributed to that economic growth, but they didn't enjoy the benefits. So racialized people contributed, racialized workers contributed, but they didn't reap the benefits. On average, non-racialized Canadians' earnings grew marginally during this period, considering that the economy grew by 13%. Non-racialized Canadians, I guess another way to say that would be white Canadians, their earnings grew 2.7%. But racialized Canadians, the average income actually declined by 0.2%. So again, more correlation, more interesting, I think, data. Why is it that in this moment of economic growth, you have some marginal growth? I mean, in a way, it says that maybe capitalism is a perhaps a fixed system, and is actually, if it's growing by 13%, why is it not also rewarding, if you will, the workers who produce that growth? Why is it only less than 3%? It seems like there's a 10% differential between the economic growth and the reward for, if you will, non-racialized workers. And then there's a negative growth, if you will. There's a clawback for people who are racialized. So again, interesting numbers. So let's review actually this notion of economic equality, right? Let's think back in terms of what are some of the repercussions and maybe hypothesis or perhaps speculative frameworks that we can apply to the Galabuzzi Block research. So one thing I think we could agree is that in looking at the Galabuzzi Block article, we can see that the economy has grown, but racialized groups don't reap the benefits. I think that's true. We don't know what the cause of that is, but I think we could say that's true. Society is becoming more and more racialized. Yeah, I think, I mean, these are my comments. I think that is true in the sense that we know from looking at the data that the immigration from non-Western countries or non-white countries is growing in Canada. And so Canada is a country that will, I think he says in the next 10 years, by 2031, will be about 30-odd% non-Western or will be racialized and non-Western racialized, I guess. And this rate of growth will accelerate. And it's not just the process of slow integration, and resettlement. I think this notion of how you have this not only the growth of racialized people in Canada through immigration and resettlement, but also, if you will, the wage disparities are growing. It seems as if there is this, if you will, growth of a underclass, if you will, that's racialized, and that class, the growth of that class is accelerating, not decreasing. So I ask you this speculative question: is there wage labor racism? Yeah, is there wage labor racism going on? Is that when we look at the numbers? And let's review some of those numbers, right? Let's look at the numerical proof that he provides, that Block and Galabuzzi provides. They show us that Koreans, or that people who self-identify as Koreans in the census, earn 69.5 cents for every dollar non-racialized workers earn, Latin Americans earn 70% for every dollar. West Asians, or people from the Middle East, earn 70 cents for every dollar. Blacks earn 75 cents for every dollar. Southeast Asians earn 77 cents for every dollar. And Chinese earn 88.6 cents for every dollar. So it would seem that there is obviously a pattern that you cannot, I think, argue against this pattern. But again, we don't know why Koreans, Latin Americans, West Asians, blacks, and Southeast Asians and Chinese are earning less. We don't know why. We know it's happening. It's a phenomenon that's happening, but we can't necessarily explain why statistically. I guess we could say it's some type of economic anomaly. But I think we could speculate that it might have to do with their, if you will, racial or ethnic origin, or their perhaps migration status. It is related, I think, that they're perhaps newcomers, but it isn't just because they're newcomers, because when you control for that question, when you look at people who have been more resettled in Canada, people who have resettled here for over a decade, these numbers are still there, or these numbers are still reflected. So here's a critical question. I think really the question for this week's readings and last week's readings: can racism be measured in wage earnings? I think the difference between people who are white and non-white and their earnings can be measured, but is that a form of racism? Yeah, I don't know. How much of that disparity is attributable to racial discrimination? So how much is the income disparity caused by, if you will, discrimination? And then here's the problem, right? Who's discriminating? It could be an overt kind of discrimination. You're not hiring certain people, or you're only hiring certain people for low-paying jobs, but for higher-paying jobs you're not, let's say. So that could be a form of discrimination. But how do you measure that? How do we know that that's actually happening? Yeah. Can statistics measure race, right? And I think this is we're getting back to that same question from last week, the Oreopoulos study, right? I think we had a very good conversation in the discussion forum last week about that, right? What explains some resumes that have a more Western name, higher levels of callback, and lower levels of callback for resumes that had a non-Western name? What other explanation, when the resumes themselves are identical, there's nothing changed in them? I think you have to think there must be some type of bias happening. Yeah. So the conclusion, I think the conclusion from reading the Block-Galabuzzi work this week is that there is a widening gap between racialized and non-racialized workers. And that widening gap is dangerous, I think. I would submit to you, and I think Galabuzzi Block are arguing similarly, that is dangerous for society, right? In the sense that if you're having this wage disparity, it is also revealing that not only is there a lack of equity in terms of wage equity in society, but there's also, if you will, perhaps a danger to democracy itself. Because I think democracy is based on this notion of equality. And if people aren't equal in terms of their wages, then that is a problem, right? I think people can be quite, not just dispirited, but they can be quite cynical about the, if you will, the social political system that we have, right? Which I think purports to be equal, free, and democratic. And I think, the widening pay gap, this is my own opinion, I think it does translate into widening social gaps. So I think you can have pay gaps, like people making more money than others, and that we can map that on to race. But it also speaks to other, if you will, problems in society, right? Sometimes we refer to it, especially in political theory, political science, as social inequality, or in social science in general, sociology as well. we refer to it as income, as social inequality. But I actually think it's more honest to say, well, maybe the reality is that we are living in a racially broken society, but that it's somehow papered over by, if you will, the ideology of multiculturalism, and that Canada is just this wonderful, equal, and equitable society. When in fact, when you look at the data from the Block and Galabuzzi studies, and you also think back to the Krishna Pendekar studies that we looked at last week, that isn't the case actually. Wage disparity is actually mapped onto race. By looking at the Pendekar study and looking at the Galabuzzi study, I think it's pretty much proven that there is some type of wage disparity that is being mapped onto race. And there are, if you will, existing and persistent patterns that are happening in society. That they're not going away. In fact, according to the Galabuzzi study, they're accelerating. And so a society that is accelerating racial division via income, I think, is a danger. I think that is a danger for us as Canadians. And that's something I think for us to discuss and for us to be mindful of. And, I look forward to us talking more about that in the live video conferences or in the discussion forums. Okay, thank you guys.